In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army troops were surrounded west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, in particular General Heinz Guderian, begged to be allowed to race on. Operation Barbarossa was working like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a couple of hundred miles from Moscow. On July the 22nd, a panzer pincer movement met to the east of the city, trapping another 310,000 Soviet troops. Here there was a brief pause, while the rest of the army caught up. Though the tanks could move at spectacular speed, most of the army still had to walk or rely on horse-drawn transport. But it still only took them 5 days before they arrived and began mopping up. The operation was completed in just 9 more days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners began trudging west to captivity. Over 2.5 million never returned. Moscow was now only 200 miles away, and the road lay open. It seemed certain it would fall by the end of the summer, as planned. But elsewhere, the German advance was finding the going more difficult. The Red Army was counterattacking more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler decided Guderian's panzers should delay their advance on Moscow and swing south to Kiev to provide help. Guderian objected strongly, but Hitler was adamant. There should be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. There were already worrying signs the Red Army was not going to be the pushover Hitler had been expecting. Soviet manpower seemed endless. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized. And the Red Army now had some formidable new weapons. In particular, a new tank, the 37-ton T-34. It had a 76mm gun and was faster and better cross-country than the Panzer Mark IV. Yet, as the blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to miss the warning signs. Guderian's Panzer Group began its thrust south on August the 23rd, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South struck north 3 weeks later. The pincers met east of Kiev on September the 16th. Two more Soviet armies were utterly destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. It was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was besieged. Hitler decided not to storm it, and the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Conditions in the city became dire. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could come in by water. Starvation set in. Over 11,000 people died in November. Not until December could an ice road be opened across the lake, and there was a slight increase in rations. But 3,700 people died of starvation on one day in December alone. Meanwhile, Army Group Center now prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had rejoined it to lead the blitzkrieg. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the front, and 3-to-1 in aircraft. The assault started on September the 20th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers slashed deep through the Red Army. By October the 7th, yet more Soviet troops were surrounded. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense of the city. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud. By late October, appalling weather and an increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant Army Group Center was still some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his decision earlier in the year to delay his advance on Moscow. At around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers. Another 100,000 prisoners were taken. But they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kharkov was captured on October the 24th, 1941. But the weather was now starting to freeze. The German forces, confident the campaign would be over by the summer, were caught unprepared. With no winter clothing, they now suffered terribly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center was now beginning its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December the 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. But that night, the temperature plunged again. Tank engines would not start. Weapons froze. Many soldiers were severely frostbitten. On December the 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army. But the Germans were confident that come the spring, they could finish the job.